Hello, everybody. Good evening or good morning, depending on from which part of the planet you are following us. And welcome to Seeds, another huge step towards our dialogues to explore with international experts challenges that are tackling mostly the climate crisis. Before introducing our very prominent guest today, which I'm very honored to host, and to have a dialogue with. I would like to remind you that these events already we are actually at the end of this very huge path and project is made with the collaboration of Green Project Society in the framework of the Climate Change Communication Award Rebecca Ballestra. And in this award, of course, is organized by the CMCC, which is the host of all these events, which is promoting the projects that are tackling the best communication initiatives through education, advocacy, media production. I remind you that you can participate by sending your project on cmccaward.eu. This is the website where you can present your project by the end of this month, June 30, and the award is 5,000 euros. So I would like to present, this is the moment of the presentation of a very prominent a guest of ours tonight and today, Michael Mann. Hello and welcome to Seeds.
Thank you, Marina. It's great to be with you.
For those who doesn't know Michael Mann, he's a prominent professor, but I can say, first of all, a veteran of many climate campaigns, and he's, let's say, the right person to meet in order to have a very constructive debate with regards to climate crisis. But tonight, we are here to talk about his new book, The New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet. This is the name of the book. And I would like to also underline that Professor Mann is a professor of atmospheric science and director of the Penn State Earth System Science Center at Pennsylvania State University in University Park, Pennsylvania. So the new climate war, this is going to be a leitmotif, let's say, the main topic of our debate tonight. And with Professor Mann, we will be able to discover what are the new techniques and what are the main, let's say, frames of this new war of ours, let's say. Not before giving the floor to Professor Mann by saying that we are actually once again hit by the current topics, because in Corbis Bay, the big leaders of G7 just made a huge promise, to invest towards the poor countries in order to tackle the climate change and everything, which is a kind of a mantra in all these years. So we will try also to make some comments with Professor Mann in order to discover how important these promises are. And while we are talking, actually, the two biggest leaders of our times are meeting, actually, Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin. So, yeah, I think our conversation is important as theirs. But before giving the floor for the discussion, which I'm very curious to make with me, Professor Michael Mann, I will give him a floor to present his book to our audience, not before mentioning that you can definitely participate, because this debate is going to end with your questions, which you can send on YouTube and, of course, on Facebook, which we are broadcasting live. And I will say this also in Italian. Dunque potete mandare I vostri messaggi, commenti, osservazioni seguendo I nostri link in diretta su Facebook e via YouTube. So I'm giving the floor to Professor Mann for the new climate war.
Grazie, Marina. Thanks for the kind introduction. And I hope that it ends up being more of a conversation than a debate. But I will provide some thoughts about the book. I was going to give a presentation, and we had some technical difficulties. So instead, I will just talk about sort of the theme of the book. Here it is, The New Climate War. And as the title implies, it's really about the challenges that we face today. We are in a war not of our own choosing. We didn't choose to be in a war, but powerful vested interests have spent decades trying to fight any effort by us, by our policymakers and our governments to actually address the climate crisis in a meaningful way. In fact, back in the early 1980s, ExxonMobil, the world's largest fossil fuel company at the time, their own scientists produced an internal report where they actually predicted how much the planet would warm up if we continued with business as usual burning of fossil fuels. And indeed, their predictions came true. They actually used the word catastrophic to describe what the impacts of such a scenario would be. So this isn't Al Gore. This isn't the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is ExxonMobil's own scientists. But instead of coming forward and engaging in a meaningful dialogue with the public and policymakers about what to do, they buried that report, they fired that division, and they engaged in a billions of dollars massive disinformation campaign to confuse the public and policymakers about the basic scientific evidence. Now, that's what I call the old climate war. It was an attack by fossil fuel interests, conservative media outlets like the Murdoch media empire, and conservative politicians. It was this effort to literally discredit the science and the scientists. And I found myself in the center of those attacks more than 2 decades ago when my co-authors and I published the so-called hockey stick curve, which demonstrated how profound the warming of the last century is in a long-term context. And it really conveyed the reality and threat of climate change. And I found myself under attack by these forces of inaction, or what I call in the book, the inactivists. And the thing is, today, the impacts of climate change are playing out in a profound way. It's just not possible to deny that climate change is happening because people can see it playing out in real time on their television screens, in their newspaper headlines, in their social media feeds. It's obvious that climate change is here. We're seeing the impacts. And so the forces of inaction have really changed their tactics. They haven't given up. But they've moved from the old climate war, which was this effort to discredit the scientific evidence and the scientists, to what I call the new climate war, a whole new array of tactics that are still aimed at keeping us addicted to fossil fuels, that are still aimed at preventing us from moving on. And in the book, I go through these tactics in detail. They include sort of soft denial. Oh, climate change is happening, but it's not a problem. And if we do anything about it, that'll destroy the economy, for example, is one of the claims they like to make, when just the opposite is true. We can see the toll that climate change impacts are now taking. The cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of action. But you also see efforts to delay action by kicking the can down the road, insisting that we just need to be more resilient, that we need to rely upon market innovation, as if the marketplace will just solve this problem on its own without any incentive to do so. And we understand that that's just not the case. We need incentives. We need to put prices, put a price on carbon. It should cost polluters when they dump their waste into our atmosphere. We should provide subsidies for renewable energy. We should block new fossil fuel infrastructure. There are all these things that we need to do. But the inactivists love to deflect attention away from those meaningful solutions and simply insist that we need to be more resilient. We just need to adapt to the changes that are coming, or to deflect attention away from the need for systemic policies and focus entirely on individuals, as if it's just you and me and our carbon footprint. We just need to decrease our individual carbon footprint. It's on us. It's not on the polluters. Well, look, there's a reason that BP, British Petroleum, gave us the world's first individual carbon footprint calculator in the early 2000s, because British Petroleum and other fossil fuel companies wanted us so focused on our own individual carbon footprint that we failed to take note of theirs. 70% of global CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, come from just 100 polluting companies. And so while we should all do everything we can do in our own daily lives to minimize our environmental impact. There are things that we can do that save us money, they make us healthier, they set a good example for other people, they make us feel good about ourselves. There are all these reasons to do that, but we cannot allow that to serve as a substitute for the policy actions that we need. And I go on to describe other tactics like doom and despair mongering. Ironically, if the forces of inaction, if the inactivists can convince us it's too late to do anything about the problem, then it potentially leads us down that same path of disengagement as outright denial. And so we see efforts by fossil fuel interests and petrostate actors. We see efforts on their part to portray climate change as a fait accompli, as beyond the point where we can do anything about it. And we have to recognize that there are good, people of good intentions and goodwill who fall victim to that sort of that messaging, to that framing, and have fallen into despair. And that means they're no longer on the front lines demanding action of our policymakers. We have to help them through that stage and help them emerge from that, help them awaken from that sort of spell that they've fallen into, because it's not too late. The science tells us it is not too late to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. As I like to say, and I say in the book, there's great urgency. We have to act now. We've got to reduce carbon emissions globally by a factor of 2 within the next decade if we are to avert more than 1.5 degrees Celsius warming of the planet, a truly dangerous interference with our climate. We have to act quickly, we have to act boldly, but there is still time to act. And so all of this is important in the new climate war, where there are these obstacles that are being thrown in our path by inactivists. And it's deflection and delay and division, getting us fighting with each other, and doom mongering, anything they can do to prevent the necessary transition away from fossil fuels toward renewable energy, to prevent that transition from happening. We have to recognize the tactics that they are using. We have to fight back against their efforts to forestall any action on climate. And that's really why I wrote this book. Because look, we're so close to finally seeing the action necessary. Even as I speak, as was alluded to earlier, there's a meeting of the G7, or now there's a summit between the United States, between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin, and climate is #1 on the agenda. It was #1 on the agenda at the G7, and there were some important developments there to help, developing countries make sure that they can grow their economies without going through the same stage that the industrial world went through, this dangerous fossil fuel stage. There's a global youth climate movement that's really raised awareness. It's recentered the issue of climate action as the defining ethical and moral challenge of our time. There's so many positive developments that have come together. We really are poised to finally see the action that's necessary, but only if we recognize and we fight back against these tactics that are currently being used by polluters. And that's really what the new climate war is about. And I look forward now to us having a more open-ended conversation about this.
Here we are. Thank you so much, Professor Mann, for this summarizing a very complex and very interesting book, which is your new publication, The New Climate War. But I would like to tackle some of the highlights that you already underlined, or better, the new tools that we have at our disposal in order to fight the old enemies. And it's not too late, as you said, but we just need to know better the new tactics of the old enemies in order to emerge ourselves and to be more aware of what can we do on our individual and collective level. So first of all, one of the things that you are representing in your book is the new tactics, and I will just highlight two of these tactics that you're explaining, deflection and division, that is used by inactivists or the old enemies in order to divide the people who are actually in the same battle. But the other thing that you are already said is doomism, which is the tool of those who maybe doesn't know that they are also the enemies of the climate war, and we are going to see why. First of all, let's start with current topics that you already mentioned. As I said, now Putin is talking and they just met, President Biden and Vladimir Putin, but actually this is the end of the 8 days of journey of the president, of the American president in the European soil. And as you said, the most important topic was the climate change and climate crisis. And the leaders, the world's rich nations which caused the climate crisis, they agreed on Sunday to raise their contributions to meet an overdue spending pledge of $100 billion a year towards the poorer countries to cut carbon emissions and cope with global warming. I would like to ask Professor Mann, first of all, starting from this first promise, how significant are group's climate pledges?
Well, it's definitely a positive development, and we need to see that through. We have to make sure that that the countries that have made that pledge really do step up and provide those resources. Because, look, as I alluded to, this is a problem that was created by the industrial world, the United States. We've been burning fossil fuels for 2 centuries. And we have created this problem. The industrial world has created this problem, but we have grown our economies on the back of dirty fossil fuel energy. And the problem is, who are we to tell the developing world, developing countries, India, African countries, developing countries around the world, that they don't have the right to that same access to cheap, albeit dirty energy to grow their own economies? We don't have the moral standing to tell them that if we're not doing everything that we can ourselves, because we have this legacy of having, the United States is the world's largest historical carbon polluter. But China today, right now, is the largest contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. And we have to make sure that China and India and the developing world skip past this fossil fuel stage in their economic development. We can't afford for them to go through that stage, to make the same mistake that we made. And that means that we have a responsibility to provide the developing world the resources to make sure that they can meet the needs of their people while not sacrificing the health of our planet in adding further to the climate crisis. And so how do we do that? We do that by providing resources. At the G7 meeting, there was a discussion about providing financing, cheap financing for building a green, clean energy infrastructure in renewable countries. We don't want them to go through the stage of building a fossil fuel driven energy grid. Let's help them build a sustainable energy infrastructure by providing them financing and providing them outright, funds. And as you said, $100 billion, I believe. That's a good start in any case. Let's recognize that climate change is going to cost us trillions of dollars a year in the damage that it's doing. So that's actually, that 100 billion sounds like a lot of money, but it's a small fraction of the damage, the annual damage that climate change is now doing. And that damage is falling disproportionately among those with the least resilience, those with the least resources, those who had the least role in creating the problem in the first place, ironically. So there is a moral obligation, an ethical obligation on the part of the industrial world, the United States, the G7 nations, to provide the rest of the world what's necessary to help them skip that stage. And again, it's a positive development, but we're going to have to see far more assistance by the industrial world if we are to help the rest of the world, again, past this dangerous stage of fossil fuel dependence.
One of the aspects that you are also highlighting in the book, which is very interesting, and that brings us also towards your everyday life. You are saying, if I'm not wrong, in one of your interviews, you say, "I don't eat meat. We get power from renewable energy. I have a plug-in hybrid vehicle. I do those things and encourage others to do them. But I don't think it is helpful to shame people who are not as far along as you." So you're actually also insisting very much in your book on how these individual actions are not going to bring us the solution. So, and of course, above all, not by shaming the others that are not doing. You're talking about the systemic change, which might be a bit the question and the topic which we tackled before, so the political changes. But I wanted to ask you really, what do you mean? What can we on the individual level do in order to also improve this systemic change that you are highlighting?
Yeah, thanks. So there's so much we can do on an individual basis, and I definitely want to make that clear. It's always a fraught, discussion, because it's too easy to turn it into a binary sort of proposition that it's either individual action or systemic change. It's both. There's no question that there's a role for both. And as I said before, we should all do those things that we can do in our everyday lives to decrease our environmental impact and our carbon footprint. And we can set a good example for others to follow. And so to me, that's sort of, we sometimes in the US, we have an expression, the carrot versus the stick. The carrot are the positive positive encouragement, whereas the stick is the negative reinforcement. And I think negative reinforcement, simply shaming people and pointing fingers at them because they're not living a life of carbon purity, or they're not, doing as much as you yourself might be doing. We know from just sort of the psychological studies that have been done that can often lead actually to resistance. It can lead to bitterness and resentment. It can have the opposite impact that you would like it to have. Much better to set a positive example, to do these things and show other people, how good you feel for doing them, that you're better off, you're healthier, you feel better about yourself, and you're part of the solution to something really important. So I think we send a positive message to others to see if we can help them down that path of minimizing, their own carbon footprint. But as you allude to, individual action alone isn't going to be enough. And there are people who simply won't care. There are people out there who don't necessarily care about the environment. They don't think about this issue in the same way that we might. And we would still like them to be making climate-friendly choices. And for them to do that, there are going to need to be incentives, economic incentives. It shouldn't cost more to choose carbon-friendly sources of energy or transportation. It should cost less because it's better for the planet. And so we need policies that provide subsidies for renewable energy, that put a price on carbon, that do block the development of additional fossil fuel infrastructure. Because even the very conservative World Economic, the International Energy Agency, has said that it is still possible to limit warming below a catastrophic 1.5 degrees Celsius, but to do so requires no additional investment now in fossil fuel infrastructure. So we need those policies. And the only way we get those policies is by electing politicians who are willing to do what's right for us, rather than simply doing the bidding of polluters who often fund their campaigns. And now that brings us back to the individual, because how do we get climate-friendly politicians? By doing everything we can. Individual action in the aggregate is what we call collective action. When we all act and we join together and we vote for climate-friendly politicians, and we vote out politicians who are simply rubber stamps for the fossil fuel industry, and we use our voice in every way possible in our everyday conversations, in what we write, in what we speak about. We use our voice to raise awareness so that there is pressure on our politicians to do what we alone cannot do and help us transition our entire global economy away from fossil fuels towards green energy and clean energy and climate-friendly practices.
Educate, educate, educate. This is one of the mantra and one of the slogans, as I can say, in your book as well, in order also to, let's say, not to preach to the converted, but to convert those who are not convinced into the subjects and topics with regards to climate crisis. I would pose another question, and I see lots of questions coming from our audience, so I will give the floor in a couple of minutes to them as well, of course. As I said at the beginning, you're also tackling the new, let's say, not very obvious enemies by the tactic that you are describing as doomism. And you are going after the far-right activists, but also, let's say, New York Times, for instance. So there are a huge range of, let's call them, new enemies in this new climate war. So how come also those that we could consider as our friends can actually be our enemies?
Yeah, well, thanks, for asking about that. And they're not our enemies. I want to make clear that, my view is they're not our enemies. They're victims, right? So there are villains here. We know who they are. Fossil fuel interests who have intentionally promoted misinformation and disinformation about climate change. Politicians who have in bad faith assisted them in that effort. Right-wing media outlets and talking heads, paid spokespeople for the fossil fuel industry. There are enough villains, when it comes to the climate wars already, that we don't need more. And the people who fall victim to that sort of despair and that doom mongering, they're not the villains. They are victims, right? They are often people that you and I, may well know as friends and family members. Who actually care about the world. They care about the problem of climate change, and they've fallen into despair because they've become convinced that it's too late for us to act. And often that belief is based on misinformation that is being put out there that is intended to lead them toward disengagement. And that misinformation takes the form of pronouncements by some, high-profile protagonists in the climate discourse. And I won't name names, but there's one prominent individual who insists that the world basically will warm beyond livable limits within the next decade. No matter what we do, we're undergoing runaway warming, and all life on Earth will be extinguished in less than 10 years. And by the way, he said that about 5 years ago. So really, that means 5 years. In 5 years, that's supposedly going to happen. And it's just nonsense. There's no science that supports that sort of scenario. In fact, the science tells us that if we act to dramatically reduce carbon emissions now, we can prevent the planet from warming beyond those catastrophic levels. So what's so pernicious about that sort of doom mongering is that it robs us of agency. It robs us of the ability to do something about the problem. And so we have to recognize people who have fallen victim to that disinformative messaging, make sure they understand that the science says the opposite. The science tells us that if we act dramatically, we can prevent the planet from warming up further. And the only thing that stands in our way really is the idea that it's too late and giving up when there still is a chance to make a better future. So what I tell people is provide them objective information, because the science that's available, the latest reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, if you go to authoritative websites and books and documents, that summarize the current state of scientific understanding. What they say is that we can prevent the warming, but here's the thing. There is agency, but there is urgency too. We do need to act dramatically. So it's really important to help people along, to take those people who have been led toward disengagement by the forces of inaction through the misleading framing of the forces of inaction, and lead them back to the battlefield so that they're on the front lines with the rest of us demanding action. And then finally, you did ask about, educate, educate, educate. Yes, we have to educate people. And I just talked about what that education process really looks like. It's not aimed at outright climate change deniers. There are still a few holdouts who will never concede that climate change is real or human caused. And we could waste every last breath that we have and all of our time and all of our resources trying to convince that small sliver of the population, maybe 9%, according to the latest polling, when we're not going to move them, and we're going to waste a whole lot of time and effort doing so. We have to focus on are the people in between who are caught in the crossfire, who have been subject to misinformation. And with a little bit of knowledge, we can, help them along. We can get them back on the front lines, and we can get them, working on their friends and their family. And it's sort of a snowball effect. It's a multiplier effect where we can really build up that critical mass that we need to get the action that we need.
Educate, educate, educate. And you are talking also about the perfect storm in your book, because this is the best chance, you're saying, in the 20 years, and you're a long-standing activist, that we have in order to tackle this battle. Of course, Greta Thunberg is one of the protagonists of this new battle, new generations that you already spoke about. I will just add maybe a small political detail that is maybe not so mainstream, but a huge, let's say, a huge news from the region. I'm coming from the former Yugoslavia, because actually all the political parties that you were saying with this structural change now are representing the real change towards the old politicians. And the latest news is that the mayor of one capital, Zagreb of Croatia, became a Green Party mayor who won over the right-wing politician, very old school one. So these are the good news from the small countries. But yeah, this is the snowball we are talking about. Step by step, this is going to be a huge shift with the political and cultural and social shift. So I will stop with my questions. Maybe I will add something afterwards, because we have really a huge number of reflections here, and I will start reading some of them.
I'll try to keep my answers more brief so we can get through.
Yeah, maybe, because we have really lots of thoughts and reflections. So Ashiv Niota is writing, is the alternative to fossil fuel already here in the form of solar, wind? Can they meet the power source for the economic growth, or new technology for energy has to be found?
Yeah, thanks, Ashwina. It's a great question. And, too often we hear from very prominent, opinion leaders like Bill Gates, former Microsoft CEO, who's written his own book about climate change and has said things like, we need a miracle. We need a miracle to solve this problem. And he is very dismissive of the role that renewable energy can play in the needed transition, and instead ends up advocating for what I would argue is a very risky path forward that depends on nuclear energy and new forms of nuclear energy that don't even exist yet, and massive carbon capture and sequestration technology that doesn't exist yet at the scale that would be necessary, and geoengineering, manipulating the environment in some other way at a global scale to try to offset warming. In my view, that's the wrong path forward. There is now some convincing literature, scientific literature, that shows, that answers your question, basically. Can we get there from renewables, from existing technology? The answer is yes. Using existing renewable technology, not relying on additional discoveries or developments, but just the renewable energy that we have today, existing wind and solar and geothermal technology and energy storage technology, we could get to 80% of global energy demand provided by renewable energy by the end of this decade, and 100% by 2050. In other words, we can get the transition that we need to avert catastrophic warming of the planet with existing renewable energy technology. The point is, we don't need a miracle, Bill Gates, and the obstacles aren't technological at this point, they are political.
Yes, you are tackling two, let's say, political and media people. Bill Gates that you just mentioned, and Rupert Murdoch that you say is the only person that actually is the protagonist from the old and the new climate war. He remained on put. So another question comes from Tobias, who is asking, fossil fuel companies are first and foremost responsible for climate change. But after climate change, some came eutrophication, the loss of biodiversity, etc. What are your thoughts on degrowth?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Tobias. So, the reality is that climate change is really just sort of one axis in this multi-dimensional space that is environmental sustainability. There are all these other axes, and the climate crisis requires dramatic action now. We simply can't delay efforts to decarbonize our economy. And so I like to distinguish between the climate crisis that requires dramatic action that does demand that we use the system that exists right now to solve this problem. We can't wait to change the system. We're not going to do away with market economics within the next 10 years, even though we might have a goal to ultimately, find some more sustainable path forward that isn't based on resource extraction and continued growth. And I think this is the premise of the question. Ultimately, we do need to confront this larger challenge of finding a way to live sustainably on this planet. And, infinite growth, at least in the context of a resource extraction-based economy, probably isn't consistent with living sustainably on this planet. So we have to have that larger conversation. But in the meantime, we have to work within the system that exists and use the lever arms that we have now to address the climate crisis. And in my view, that means that we do have to use the tools of market economics, carbon pricing, subsidies for renewables, to change, to make progress on this problem now, to decarbonize our economy now, while working at, ultimately to find a more sustainable path forward. So it's not either or, it's both. But right now, let's use the tools that are available to us to address the climate crisis, because there literally is no time left for us to act.
There is also Emanuele who is posing these questions, saying, I'm curious about your point of view on carbon fee and dividend approach promoted by James Hansen, which you might know I'm not aware of, but as well as the introduction of latest generation nuclear power.
Yeah, so, there are various forms of carbon pricing, and I've chosen to not sort of try to put my thumb on the scale to weigh in with any one particular vehicle. My view is that carbon pricing is an important tool in the toolbox. And there are opponents who argue that it's somehow inadequate or it's inconsistent with social justice. Neither of those things are true in my view, and I explain why in the book. I think that carbon pricing is an important part of any solution, and it can be done actually in a progressive manner. It's been done, it's been progressive. It's actually helped out low-income earners in places like Australia and Canada where it's been implemented. So it can be done in a way that's consistent with social justice. But it's not going to solve the problem on its own. It's one of the tools, and we need them all. We need carbon pricing. We need subsidies for renewables. We need policies that prevent additional fossil fuel infrastructure from being built, et cetera. When it comes to the precise form of carbon pricing, there are a lot of proposals out there. There's fee and dividend, as Emmanuel asks about, and my colleague James Hansen, sometimes called the grandfather of climate change, one of the first climate scientists to really speak out back in the 1980s about the threat of catastrophic climate change. He advocates for a particular form, a fee and dividend, where the revenue is returned to the people, and I think that is a viable instrument. But there are other proposals as well. There's cap and trade, there's carbon pricing, and that can be carbon tax, that can be a revenue neutral carbon tax, it can be the fee and dividend proposal that was mentioned. I'm happy for our politicians to be debating the precise form of the prescription, as long as it's informed by an assessment of the threat that climate change poses and the need for meaningful solutions. I'm happy to have them debate in good faith the form that those solutions should have. Now, nuclear, I've already alluded to the fact that I am not especially supportive of the idea that nuclear energy can be a major part of sort of our path towards decarbonization. And that just has to do with the fact that it's expensive. It's actually a lot more expensive than renewable energy, so it requires massive government investment. It obviously comes with risks. We know what those are: proliferation risks, environmental risks, and there's no way that can be eliminated, despite the promises that have been made by some proponents of sort of new new generation nuclear technology. And, it potentially crowds out investment in what I would argue is a much safer and better solution, which is renewable energy. And so I'm not very supportive of nuclear energy as a major part of any proposal to decarbonize our economy. But hey, let's have that debate. There are people that I respect, people of good faith, who I consider honest and objective, who have a different opinion. And that's the sort of debate that we should be having, what the form of the solution looks like, but not whether we need to act. That debate is over. What the form of that action should take, there's a healthy debate to be had there.
Trevor is asking, is there a reason why the IPSS still produce scenarios based on bioenergy with carbon capture and storage technologies that we've been waiting on for decades and remain as pilot projects?
Yeah, so the IPCC has put forward these various sorts of scenarios or pathways. They have different names and they reflect different assumptions. And I don't take any one of them very seriously. The way I look at them is they provide sort of a range of possible paths forward. And some of them are dependent on certain types of technology, like BECCS, which is referred to here. The idea that we produce energy from organic matter, it's bioenergy, and we capture the CO2 that's released and we bury it. It almost seems too good to be true. We're getting energy and we're burying carbon at the same time. And so, because the bioenergy starts out as carbon neutral because the organic matter, the carbon that's in there came out of the atmosphere in the first place. So then if we generate energy and we capture the carbon that's released in the process and we bury it, we're actually engaging in net burial of carbon. We're drawing down CO2 levels and we're getting energy at the same time. You can see why it's attractive. It almost sounds too good to be true. And the reality is that while it's not impossible, it doesn't violate any laws of physics, despite the fact that it might seem to. But we're not there yet. And the idea that this should be a major part of any proposal for how we address the climate crisis, say within the next 10 or 20 years, I think is misplaced, because we're not going to be able to deploy that sort of technology at scale where it would really make a dent in our carbon budget within that time frame where we really need to bring carbon dioxide levels, carbon emissions down dramatically. So the danger here, and we see this with a lot of these net zero commitments, when people say net zero, hidden in this idea of net zero is that we don't literally mean necessarily that we're not emitting carbon into the atmosphere. What it means is we might be putting carbon into the atmosphere, but we're taking it out at the same time. That depends on the assumption that we will have these sort of technologies and we'll be able to deploy them at scale in the future. And the danger of these sorts of proposals and geoengineering and other such proposals is that you're kicking the can down the road. You're sort of buying license to pollute now based on the promise that may ultimately never be fulfilled, that you're going to take carbon out of the atmosphere later. I think that that is a foolish and dangerous gambit. And so I don't think that the promise of future carbon uptake by bioenergy, capture or any other means, we can't allow that to be used as an argument for doing less now with the technology that we have. And we have to look out for politicians who talk a good game, but in fact, when you look at the details of their proposal, they are relying on the idea that we can kick the can down the road and delay the hard decisions till later so that they don't have to make them now.
There is a kind of let's call it a cultural reflection posed by Bernie, who is sharing his experience, saying, a person I spoke with recently suggested that there may need to be a shift in attitude so that when a person makes a purchase, they no longer delight in saving money, but maybe come to delight and are more satisfied to be doing something positive for the planet. That is quite a mind shift, but not impossible, to monetize our mindset. You told us something about that also while we were talking about this individual, let's say, actions that needs to go above the money, right?
Yeah, and there are actually countries that have implemented such a system. I believe Bhutan, for example, where their economy, if you will, is built on an assumption that what you want to maximize isn't GDP, global domestic product, economic output, but sort of happiness, well-being. And I think it's a delightful concept, and I think it's one to aspire to. It's a system to aspire to. And so when I spoke earlier about the need to find a way to live more sustainably on this planet, ultimately that's what I mean. I mean an economy that favors the public good and the good of the environment over the short-term wealth of individuals. And we need to work towards that. I'm not Pollyannish about this. I don't think we will see that sort of dramatic transition in our global economy within the next 10 years. And that's the time frame on which we really have to act with respect to the climate crisis. So that's why I emphasize once again, let's work within the system that exists right now, the market economy and the accompanying economics, to solve this problem now, even as we work towards creating a better system for us, for our children, and our grandchildren.
I forgot one more question from Umberto, who is asking about your outlook on potential cascading multi-risks conjured by pre-existing hazards, somehow overprinted by climate change and its complex behavior.
So, there are, so-called tipping point. I think what this is getting at is tipping point elements within the climate system that we worry about. We warm up the planet enough, we start, actually, I'm going to read the statement again. So, the question sort of gets at the complex nature of the climate system. It is a complex system, and that means that there are potential surprises and tipping point elements, as I was alluding to, where you warm up the planet and you set in motion some sequence of events that becomes unstoppable. And one very good example of that is the collapse of the ice shelves off Antarctica that are destabilizing large part of the West Antarctic ice sheet to the point where it's starting to surge into the ocean and contributing to global sea level rise earlier than we expected. This is also true with extreme weather events. Some of my own research suggests that there are some complexities about how climate change influences the jet stream in a way that gives us some of these very persistent extremes, like we've seen in Europe this summer and like we've seen in the United States. Very persistent extreme heat events or flooding events. And the climate models don't capture all of the physics. Our own work suggests that they're not capturing some of the physics relevant in understanding how climate change is impacting these extreme weather events. And so what it comes down to, and what the question is getting at, I think at some level, is, we're toying with this complex system and we don't understand it perfectly. That's not cause for inaction. The uncertainty is not, as the critics would try to argue, a reason not to act. If anything, the uncertainty and the potential for unpleasant surprises is a reason to act even more dramatically. So yes, there are potential tipping point responses, and the more we warm the planet, the more likely it is we set those in motion. And some of them may already have been set in motion. We worry that the collapse of large parts of the ice sheets and the sea level rise that comes with that we're very close, if not already at the point of committing to those changes with the warming that's taken place thus far. And it simply it really underscores the need to act dramatically now. Every ton of carbon that we don't burn makes us better off in the future, and we have to focus on that.
I would like to finish our debate, this constructive discussion, also thanks to our listeners and followers, by also putting on the table the year that we are actually living still, the pandemic year, the COVID-19, which definitely changed our lives, and our lives are still being changed by this impact, but also the climate crisis battle changed by the COVID-19. And in your book, you're saying that actually we are still far short of the Second World War level of mobilization that you and others said in order to keep global heating 1.5 degrees. And the question is, have the prospects for that have been helped or endangered by the COVID-19, and how this year actually put all the attention on the sanitary, let's say, and health problems, and detached or maybe helped the climate crisis issue?
Yeah, thanks. We could have a whole hour-long conversation about the lessons to be learned from COVID-19, from the pandemic, and there's so many lessons to be learned, and we don't know the answers to those questions yet. We still, will we take away the right lessons or the wrong lessons? That remains to be seen. I hope we take away the right lessons. The right lessons would be, how fragile our existence on this planet is. Our lives can be turned upside down by this microscopic organism. I hope that leads, and has led and will continue to lead to, to some amount of modesty on our part, a recognition of the fragility of our environment, and the challenges that come with trying to live sustainably on a finite planet with nearly 8 billion and growing people competing for finite food and water and space, as we engage in actions that actually lead to decreases in those available resources. So we are not on a sustainable path right now. I hope that the pandemic leads us to recognize that this path isn't sustainable, and that we start to make some of those changes that will put us on a more sustainable path forward. I think there's a conversation that has begun that I hope will continue, that has come out of this tragedy. Sometimes out of a tragedy comes opportunity, and perhaps this will serve as an opportunity to rethink our way of life. More than that, there are lessons here about the importance of listening to the word of science. We had an administration, Donald Trump and his administration, that ignored what public health scientists were saying. And as a result, hundreds of thousands of people in our country died who didn't need to die. Science denial is deadly. And we learned that, and we saw that in such a vivid way with the pandemic. I hope we absorb that method and understand that it has implications for an even greater crisis that will cost far more human lives if we fail to act. And that's the climate crisis.
Yes, we would really need a whole new discussion on the impacts. And of course, all the promises that we on the individual level made with regards to the changes in our lives, and that many of us actually forgot. But unfortunately, the leaders and the political promises also have been changed and completely modified to the previous year. But hopefully we will really keep our, let's say, reflections with regards to what is really important on this planet and us on this planet. Professor Mann, there are so many other questions here. I'm sorry, we have to close this session because we had an hour available. So I would suggest that all these questions might be collected and maybe sent to Professor Mann, and maybe privately you can send. I will just read one reflection from Alessandra, who is saying that she disagrees. We can avoid the shift only with the shift, climate shift, and with mental shift. It is the mind shift that will actually move everything. And there are questions, can we see this webinar again? And of course, I remind all of our followers that this webinar can be followed and see once again on all the channels of CMCC. So you have to go on their website, and also to participate, I remind you, on the award. On YouTube, of course, there is a link, and if you go on a Facebook, you can see once again the whole session. And I would like to remind all the listeners and followers that about the award that I was mentioning at the beginning, because I see many people who are actually in the field and posing very precise technical questions, which I'm very fond of, about Rebecca Ballestra Award that is organized by CMCC and Green Project Society. And if you go on the website, I remind you, cmccaward.eu, you can participate onto this petition. Michael Mann, professor, is part of the jury, and you can win 5,000 euros, but not only monetary compensation, also maybe intellectual and what we were saying, cultural shift towards contribution in this battle. And in the new climate war, if we can finish like that, this is all the actions and all the contributions and projects that are part of this new awareness. So thank you so much, Professor Mann, for taking your time and for your contribution towards our society with your new book. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It was really a pleasure, Marina. And let me mention, by the way,
Please.
People can find me on Twitter, Michael E. Mann at Twitter, so we can continue the conversation there. And I did want to mention that the new climate war will be coming out in Italian sometime within the next year. So look out for
this. Is great. This is great news. So the new climate war, the fight to take back our planet, something to think about on a daily basis. Thank you so much, and see you soon, hopefully on these screens. Have a nice evening or day. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.